Perhaps I will just start by giving an introduction of our series and our speaker today, Dr. Jacques, again, because I know that we have plenty of new guests joining us today. So welcome you all. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again, or welcome back to Methods in Sinology, lecture series organized by Ms. Madalena Poli, PhD candidate at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, University of Pennsylvania, and Ms. Mariana Zorkina, PhD candidate at the Asian Orient Institute, University of Zurich. My name is Zheng Oscar, and I'm a first-year PhD student majoring in East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, I'm more than honored to be given the opportunity to chair this lecture by Dr. Guillaume Jacques on historical phonology. Dr. Guillaume Jacques is currently senior researcher at the Center for East Asian Linguistics, CRLAO, in Paris, France. He mainly researches the Jaronic languages, in particular the Japhuk language, as well as the Kaling language, a member of the Kiranti languages, with interest in language documentation, typology, especially voice and indexation, panchronic linguistics, neo-grammarian historical linguistics, language phylogeny, and ethnolinguistics. His most recent research projects include his new book, A Grammar of Japhuk, published by the Language Science Press in Berlin this year, and the compilation of a Kaling Nepali English Verb Dictionary, which is available in the online academic archive, HAL. Since we have quite an audience today, we restricted the possibilities to turn on cameras and microphones during the lecture for better security and to ensure minimum audio and video interference. At the end of today's lecture, there will be a Q&A session. You can take part in the session by using the hand-raising function in Zoom, and then we'll allow you to turn on your camera and microphone for you to ask your questions in person. Or you can type your questions in chat, and we will read out your questions for you. Please also note that this event is being recorded. If you do not wish to appear on the recorded video, please make sure your camera is turned off and send your questions to us through chat so that we can read them out for you. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Guillaume Jacques.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So I'm going to share with you my presentation, and we'll start right away. So today's presentation will focus on Old Chinese. Last time I presented Middle Chinese and its relevance to Chinese literature, Chinese history, and Chinese philosophy. I hope that I managed to convince you, especially when it comes to reading pre-Han classical texts on which we have some glosses, that knowledge of Middle Chinese is useful, and that we can use this knowledge to gain a better understanding, at least understand them as scholars in the Sui dynasty did. Now, if we want to go further back than the some glosses we find in medieval dictionaries, and attempt to reconstruct. Okay, so in today's lecture, I'm going to focus on three main topics. First, our sources for Old Chinese historical phonology, traditional sources in particular, and also some new promising sources. Then I will talk about some myths about Old Chinese, which go back to the 19th century, which but are still quite powerful, both in mainland China and in the sinological circles. And third, related to those topics, I will talk about Chinese as a Sino-Tibetan language and what it means when we study ancient texts. Okay. Traditionally, the basic methodology for reconstructing Old Chinese goes back to the Qing dynasty. Yeah, that's well known. There are a lot of materials explaining the history from Gu Yanwu and Duan Yucai, etc. This is well known. This was then used by Cartgren and other Western scholars and Chinese scholars, of course, like Li Fangui in the 20th century, to propose the first reconstruction of all Chinese. So it's basically projecting Middle Chinese. The starting point is Middle Chinese, so what we've seen last week, last session. And projecting this system onto two independent sources of data. One is the rhyming, especially in the Shijing. We'll discuss the Shijing and give some examples. And another source of data are the phonetic series that we'll discuss a little bit. I won't focus too much on philological sources because this is the kind of data you can find in most handbooks of Old Chinese historical phonology. It would require a semester long amount of teaching to explain it clearly. I'm just going to provide a few examples to show you how it generally works. What's the basic principle, and what you need to know when you see an Old Chinese reconstruction. And then I will discuss new sources of evidence, the comparative evidence, which comes from Sinitic languages. So this is not radically new. We know that not all varieties of Chinese originate from a language that corresponds to the phonological system encoded in a Qieyun. Yeah, we have some dialects that preserve pre-Qieyun features. Min is the most famous, but Bai, I think it's a Chinese dialect, a Chinese Sinitic language, and also preserve even older elements. Then the loan words, ancient loan words, and of course Sino-Tibetan comparison. Okay, let's have a look now at the philological sources. Wait a little bit. Okay, so let's have a look at what it means to use, rhyming initiative. Okay, well, for that, before I show you what I've done here, before we go on to this to this slide, I'm going to switch to another switch here to this website. So you've already some of my colleagues have already presented this extraordinary website, which contains a lot of data on Old Chinese phonology. It contains in particular a complete database of rhyming. So the section on Chuzi is not yet completely ready. We just have scans of Wang Li's book. But for the Shijing, if you click, for instance, here, and you get this rhymes, annotated rhymes with Middle Chinese provided. Okay. Now, let's have a look at the poem I've chosen for reasons that will be obvious later. The poem Hmong-Mien, which is also very famous and quite interesting for other purposes. And let's have a look at some of these rhymes. So we are focusing on this section. Yeah, we are focusing on this section. Now, so the reason I chose this is because we have this character hai, which Zhou Boqun in his lecture discussed a little bit the case of this character. Now, and so we'll see what historical phonology and what it has to tell us about this rhyme. Yeah. So we see here for the Middle Chinese indicated with this 6 characters, sorry. So this is the traditional way of representing Middle Chinese. It is structurally identical to the Baxter's transcription. So it's just a transcription in Latin script that convey the same amount of information as these characters. But just for most people, I personally believe that an orthographic representation is probably easier to memorize than this character. So that's a reason for, I would personally avoid using this and favor Middle Chinese transcriptions. Yeah. We see that in some cases we have 2 characters, two readings. For instance, here for ta, it gives two readings. Yeah, because some characters indeed have several readings encoded. So here we have this extraordinary database. But if you have no training in historical phonology, it's a bit difficult to use. Now let's have a look at what I've prepared for you. So what I did was first to apply to this excerpt the same kind of procedure I did for the excerpt of the Zuoduan last week. Yeah. So I indicate here in blue readings which are indicated in the Shiwen. Yeah. And you see here that includes this rhyming character, ta. Yeah. So actually, we know it should be pronounced tat and not dat. We had an so let's go back to the previous screen. So here, actually, what the compilers of this website did, which is very good, they indicated Middle Chinese, but here they leave the ambiguity. Yeah, but well, if we now look into the Shiwen's database, you see here it's a Shangmin, and we can see that at least this reading is selected here. So it indicates ta mo fa. It corresponds to the reading that tat that we saw just before. Yeah? So this means that although this database is very good, we still need an extra layer of work to make a really comprehensive Middle Chinese edition of the treaty. This is the starting point for us. Yeah? So you see here this character. This is not a rhyming character. And so what we see here is that you saw this hai and this da, tat and gai were encoded as rhymes just before. They had the same color. So in the case of these two, leng, neng, these two, zi, zi, they are still rhyme in Middle Chinese. Yeah. So I think it doesn't, it's not a problem. But here, these three, nguot, tat, gai, these 3 characters have different rhymes in Middle Chinese. Certainly do not rhyme in Sui or Tang Dynasty poems. But they do rhyme here, and we can find other rhymes of the same type in the rest of the Shiji. It's not very strange. Yeah? This means that this rhyme, which corresponds to Middle Chinese what, had probably, so the same consonant, that's obvious, but probably also the same vowel as this rhyme. And that here also we had, so we still have R here, but this te and this ye somehow correspond to each other. Yeah. So that's an interesting observation. Yeah. And Old Chinese reconstruction are devised to account for this kind of rhyming that doesn't work in Middle Chinese. Or sometimes words that rhyme in Middle Chinese but don't rhyme in Middle Chinese. That's even more tricky to find. Now, let's have a look at one reconstruction, Baxter Saga's reconstruction. I'll talk a bit about why there's such a controversy about this reconstruction. and what if you're not a linguist, or if you're not a phonologist, what you should, how you should think for yourself about these issues. Now, here are the reconstructions. So I put colors for you, so you can see. So here we see that some rhymes are there are little changes for these ones. For these, where schwa correspond to e, so it still remains very limited. But here we see interesting things. Yeah. So they all reconstructed at. Yeah. And this one is reconstructed with an extra s, which corresponds to the Chusheng. And we also have a t. Yeah. Now, if we only had this source, if we only had the rhymes, would that be enough to reconstruct the whole system? It would be difficult. Now, fortunately, we have another source of data, the phonetic series. So, as you all know, 形声字 combine two parts. One part is semantic, and the other part is phonetic, reflects the pronunciation. But it reflects the pronunciation at the time that the character was created. Now, if you look at this character and read them in Middle Chinese, yeah, they share the same high element. Yeah? But you see that the pronunciation, even more in Mandarin, ge and hai have nothing in common. Yeah? But in Middle Chinese, kat and gai already are more similar. Yeah? And you remember in Zhou Boqun's presentation, there was this, I remember there was a comparison between a hai and ge, I think, yeah, in terms of an issue about paleography. So here we can explain why these two may indeed resemble each other. We see the pattern here. What is the pattern? We have a r initial and a k initial. We have a final t, and here we have y and a tusheng. You see? Now, and here you have this vowel, so I won't discuss this one, but just look before, exactly the same pattern that between at I, we find the same pattern here at I. So this observation was first formulated by Duan Yucai. The observation that characters that have the same phonetic series, the same phonetic element, yeah, characters that have the same phonetic element, normally, well, belong, their rhyme belong to the same rhyme group in a shijing. So they are potential rhymes in a shijing. So it doesn't go the other way around, of course. Huh? The fact that two characters rhyme in a shijing doesn't imply they share the same phonetic. It would be, if it were the case, then the initial consonant wouldn't count. But that's a very useful observation. It means what? It means we have two independent sources of data. We have the rhymes and we have the phonetic series. Now, what's the problem with the rhymes? The rhymes are useful, but they're not always exact rhymes. Yeah? That's one first problem. Another problem is that not all characters rhyme in a shijing. Yeah? Actually, only a minority of characters rhyme in a shijing. So if we wanted to reconstruct all Chinese and only had rhymes, we would be in trouble because most characters, we won't have information for them. Yeah. Another problem is that rhymes don't deliver any information about initial consonants. So we wouldn't have any way of thinking about, we would not have any philological source to study all Chinese consonants. So here we see what in this little series, we see that ke and re, these two initial consonants, jianmu and xiamu, in traditional phonology, they co-occur in the same series, meaning that probably at the time that these characters we created, they sounded similar. Now, sound similar, of course, what does it mean? Yeah. that's the whole problem. Not all specialists agree about these criteria, but what all reconstruction system over Chinese do is to account for these two sources at least, plus Middle Chinese. So put Middle Chinese into the categories of rhymes and into the categories of phonetic series. So how do? You take all the rhyme initiating, you classify the words that rhyme with each other and the Middle Chinese values, and you do the same with phonetic series. So you see which rhymes can rhyme with which rhymes and can occur in the same series. And then you have a way to propose that some rhymes from Middle Chinese have a common origin in Old Chinese, whatever was the trigger of the further differentiation in Middle Chinese. Yeah. So here are Baxter and Segar's reconstruction. You see that, for instance, for the G, they either propose a G or propose a K preceded by a nasal that voices the following consonant. Yeah. So you see, we see that in this system, all these four characters share the same basic element cut with this pharyngalization element feature. Now, in Zhou Boqun's presentation, there was also this little series and the comparison with these two. There was now a discussion about this. Now, if we just look at this series, what do we see? We see words starting with L. We see that uk and liuk occur. And here we have elk and a P initial. Now, what's the first question you should ask yourself? The question which is relevant here is, if you look at the rhymes in the shading, does yuk, uk, and elk rhyme with each other? The answer is they do. They do, and they don't rhyme with other rhymes. That's an interesting point. So liuk and luk rhyme with each other, but they don't normally rhyme with ok and with yuk, for instance. That's the interesting thing. But they do rhyme with auk. Yeah. And they can rhyme in certain cases with o also. Yeah, this rhyme here. How is it that we have P here and L here? That's also a puzzling problem. Yeah. Even in Middle Chinese, these characters don't look really similar. And we could even wonder whether there's any relationship between them. But so since Karlgren, the thinking has been that to explain these divergent initial consonants, we should reconstruct, in many cases, consonant clusters. That's a very controversial kind of idea, which is still not accepted by several scholars, especially in mainland China. So the school of Wang Li, for instance, is very opposed to this kind of reconstruction. Of course, Karlgren's proposals are not all correct. Some have been severely criticized by many scholars, and rightly so. But here the thinking is that we have here a PR initial. PR, the R merges with the vowel, and only P remains. And here you had R, which changes to L. And this explains a lot of this. So P or K with L in the same series. We have a lot of these in Old Chinese phonetic series. I'm sure you can think of many examples. Now, this is also the interesting point here is that there's also evidence from non-Chinese languages that you have a cluster in this word, yeah, especially in Kredai family. So in some cases, there is direct evidence. We'll see more examples of that later. The question we can ask now is whether a comparison with these two guys is conceivable. So here the main problem, so actually, you see, here the problem is, so that when they write, Baxter and Sagar write R here, it means if there was an R, we can't tell, because the Middle Chinese sometimes preserves information about R's. Well, that's the case here. But with some rhymes, in particular O, this information is lost. So you can never tell when you have an O whether there was an R or not. Now, if there was an R, we would have a raw element, and which would be here. And well, the question is, could we have a K here? I would say that there's no evidence for that. It's a bit difficult, but we could imagine several things. But in general, I think that this comparison is requires more research. So I'm not going to discuss too much about these issues. Studying them in a systematic way to combine all this, the data from Middle Chinese, from philological sources, and from rhyming. What understanding a reconstruction implies being able to explain where each element in a reconstruction come from. Yeah? So if we have here this reconstruction, let's say this one is easier, grat. Understanding this reconstruction means knowing how, if you see this character, derive this protoform by a set of rules. So if you don't understand the reconstruction, yeah, my personal thinking is that if you need to quote reconstructions in a paper, for instance, I would advise against blindly copying reconstruction, especially mixing reconstruction from several systems, something I've seen in papers by well-meaning non-linguist colleagues. But make sure you get help from a phonologist to explain to you the details, yeah, and whether it's useful for your own work. Yeah. But it's important to understand what you are copying, rather than just copy-paste from the website. Yeah. It's become very easy now to copy-paste reconstructions, but I would prefer you to cite Middle Chinese. I think this is quite easy to do because there's only one Middle Chinese system in general, and there are variant orthographies, but they are all equivalent. But for Old Chinese, systems are not equivalent between one another, and systems represent a condensation of many sound laws and many hypotheses, which I think is it's very important to understand before you use them. It's a bit like statistics. It's very tempting to use, but it's preferable to ask for help. Now, Old Chinese has the bad reputation of being an arcane field. Yeah, I don't know whether it is or not, but I would hope that it becomes a normal field that more people study and is not restricted to a small clique of specialized scholars. Yeah. The importance of Old Chinese, I think, in addition to better understanding the Shijing texts, and is also debunking a series of myths about Chinese, which we have due to the fact that we read ancient text through Mandarin. This is a big difference with ancient Greek, for instance. In ancient Greek, even those who read it with, for instance, French pronunciation, there are plenty of them, they understand that it's a distinct language, that it has distinct grammar, and not an extension of some modern language, even Greek, even modern Greek. In Chinese, it's less clear that it's the case. So, for instance, if you took a wonderful book like He Le Shi's Grammar of the Zuozhuan, which is immensely useful and insightful, there is not a single mention of this book of the morphological alternations in the Zuozhuan, as if it were a different field, although these alternations are quite relevant to some of the issues treated in that book. So this could already have been adverted if Middle Chinese had been used, but Old Chinese adds a new way of interpreting these alternations and enrich our understanding of Chinese grammar. In addition, it's a way of so Chinese. The traditional way we perceive Chinese is as the prototypical, tonal, isolating, and monosyllabic language, like Hmong-Mien languages, Kra-Dai languages, Lolo-Burmese, Vietnamese. We have a huge linguistic area of languages which share these features. For a long time, people have thought that this was even a marker of genetic relationship. Now, most scholars outside of mainland China don't believe that. For instance, few people would argue that Thai and Chinese are genealogically related, at least not in a way, not recently. Not that Chinese is closest to Thai than it is to Tibetan, for instance. That was a traditional thinking expressed, for instance, by Li Fangui. Now, this view of Chinese as a tonal, isolating, monosyllabic language, what can Old Chinese tell you about it? Also, what does this Old Chinese reconstruction can tell us about the nature of the Chinese script? I think that's something, a point where phonology and paleography, these two sister disciplines, have to work hand in hand. And we also need more scholars fully trained in both fields to be able to fully understand all the issues that are at stake here. So let's focus on the first two. Now, in Baxter Saga's reconstruction, basically, the kernel of the reconstruction is not significantly removed from the system that was, for instance, in Baxter 92 or Starostin or Zheng Shangfang, these three reconstruction systems that are based on the work by Fully-Blanc and Yahun, the 6 vowel system. So it belongs to the 6 vowel system subtype of Old Chinese reconstruction. In many ways, this system differs from the previous systems by adding more things, by adding more distinctions that are not visible in Middle Chinese. And that's the reason why they were severely criticized by many scholars, including Hausmeyer, He Daan, and Schüssler, and also the students of Sun Yuwen. So many scholars have severely criticized this book, but I think that there is a very important contribution that I want today to treat. I think is relevant to everybody, even non-linguists. What Baxter and Saga have done for Old Chinese is trying to systematically integrate into the reconstruction of Old Chinese data from borrowings, Old Chinese borrowings into neighboring languages. In particular, Kra-Dai, Sino-Vietnamese, Hmong-Mien, and also study, of course, the Min and other Sino-Tibetan languages. Now, there's a methodological problem here. these languages, so Kradai, Vietnamese, so here you have Lakya and Sui, which are Kam Sui languages. So they belong to the Kradai family. They are related to Thai and Lao, distantly related. Here, Vn is Vietnamese, and Ruk is a Vietic language closely related to Vietnamese, although they don't look very similar. And Min, yeah. So Min is just a Sintic variety. And what they propose is that the earliest layers of borrowing from Old Chinese into these languages contain elements that have left no trace elsewhere. No trace in most Semitic languages, no trace in phonetic series. So that's sometimes frightening. It means that the traditional sources, it doesn't mean they are not reliable. They are reliable to some extent, but they are not enough to reconstruct Old Chinese. So Old Chinese were very much more removed from what we usually imagine. Now, these sources, how to interpret them? The problem is you could argue when you see different things, things that differ between these languages and Old Chinese. Is it possible, for instance, that some of these languages added elements? So here, let's look at these words. This is one of the most important tables in the book, and I think it's highly instructive. What Baxter and Saga propose here for these 5 words, yeah. So some of them quite recent, like paper. Yeah. It's a Han dynasty innovation. We're not talking about very, very old Chinese. It's not even warring states. Yeah. So what they present here is evidence that so the borrowings from Old Chinese into these languages. So in the case of Ruk, it's most obvious. You have a ke element here. In the case of Lakya, Lakya is a Kam Sui language which differs from all other languages of the same family in that when you have disyllabic words, the presyllable eats up the following consonant, and you get only the presyllable as the main consonant. So when you have kie here, it means that you had something like this, like the Ruk form, but the ke ate up the initial consonant, yeah. And we get this result. Now, one question is, so in Middle Chinese we only have tie. Is this tie, so we only have one syllable, we don't have a cluster, but here we have 2 elements, this disyllabic word, this keja. And we have this element here. Now, is this element something that the Ruk or the Vietic, Proto-Vietic added to these roots? Now, the problem here is that one commonality between Vietic, Kam Sui, Kradai in general, and also Hmong-Mien is that these are isolating languages that lack the irrational and inflectional morphology. Very little evidence for morphology in these languages. There is no such thing as a prefix ke in Ruk or Vietic. So there is no reason why, if this word had been loaned into these languages in the Han Dynasty, they would have added a syllable to them. It's not like these other languages, like the Gaorong languages we're going to talk about a bit later, which have a very productive morphology. So of course, even in Japuk, for instance, as we'll see, even a modern Chinese loanword can undergo some morphological changes, and you can add prefixes on it. But for this language, for Ruk, for Vietnamese, Lakya, there is no evidence of morphology. So the logical conclusion is that the donor language, so the Chinese dialect from which these words were borrowed, had an element here. So it's also visible in Vietnamese, though less. In Vietnamese here, we have a G. Now this letter, unlike what you may think, it represents originally a R or a Y. So now it's pronounced the or ye, depending on the dialect. Here is ram, yeah, for instance, it's a lenified consonant. Yeah. And we know from the studies on Vietnamese phonology that when you have this G, it means that there is a lost consonant that is not present in Vietnamese, but is present in other languages like Ruk. In Lakya, we see also evidence for this pre-syllable. And what's even more interesting is the same point of articulation as in Vietnamese, as in Vietic. So it can hardly be a chance resemblance. Now, these examples, I think, show what? They indicate that even in the Han Dynasty, so the paper was invented, we know the date when it was invented. Even in the Han Dynasty, Chinese still had pre-syllables. It means that characters possibly had not just consonant clusters, but possibly indicated a syllable with a minor syllable, a schwa-like syllable before it. Yeah. Or a cluster like te. This is vertiginous, the implication for that. The problem is that we only have a few words that are attested, all Chinese loanwords attested in Vietic, at least in a non-Vietnamese branch of Vietic that preserves pre-syllables. These kind of examples are rare. We can reconstruct them for a few cases like that, but for the bulk of the vocabulary of Old Chinese, we lack a lot of data. Another interesting thing is, for instance, in the case of Min, is that when here it's a voice consonant, in Min you have an aspirated voice. So there's a lot of debate about the status of this aspirated voice consonants. But in Min, you also have an alternation between aspirated voice, meaning bandit, the noun, and the plain voice, meaning harm, the verb. Yeah. So here, it would imply that this may be a trace of an alternation, a morphological alternation in Old Chinese, and mean that this ke actually had a morphological function in Old Chinese. And this is not reflected even in a shiwen, a very crucial morphological feature, difference between noun and verb, which is not reflected either in the characters or in a shiwen. And only we can only guess its existence from combining Min and the very early borrowings in these languages. But these data need to be explained. So when people criticize Baxter and Sagar for introducing data of this type, my answer to them would be, what do you make of this? Yeah? You need to explain this data. These pre-syllables cry for an interpretation. One of the most important sources for this kind of elements is Vietnamese. So in a few cases, we have cognates, like in languages like Ruk, that are more conservative than Vietnamese and have preserved the pre-syllables. In other cases, we only have Vietnamese, whose vocabulary is much more better attested. And we see how we have these cases like this. So words that are quite obviously from Chinese, but have V instead of P. D, here D marks originally in the 16th century, it marked the, but now it's pronounced either the or ye, depending on the dialect. But anyway, it corresponds to a T in Chinese. So this the should not be read as a stop. It's a fricative. Thou, Middle Vietnamese, thou, now thou to tao. Yeah? And the same with this G, it doesn't mean ge, it means re. So it's also a fricative. Now we have cases with voice fricatives in Vietnamese corresponding to stops in Middle Chinese. These are early loanwords, pre-Sino-Vietnamese loanwords. and there's quite a quantity of them. What they indicate, we know by the sound laws of Vietic, which I think all phonology specialists of all Chinese should learn. We know that there were presyllables in words that now have these lenified initials. But so that's the reason why Baxter and Sagar write a C dot here. Yeah? They write a C dot because of these this Vietnamese evidence. The Vietnamese evidence has not yet been fully studied. There's a lot of data to be new evidence for presyllables to be found in Vietnamese and Vietic in general. Unfortunately, Vietic languages are threatened of extinction and have not been very well described. So we probably there are precious data on Old Chinese phonology and morphology that are disappearing, like a book being burnt at the present moment. Yeah, and few people even care about them, and it's difficult to do fieldwork now because of the outbreak. But in any case, I think that this is a very promising field for future studies and contributes to answering the second issue. Yeah? Was Chinese a monosyllabic language? Was it isolating? We saw in the previous presentation that the Shuwen readings suggest that Old Chinese was not so isolating. Yeah? There were more alternations in Middle Chinese than in any modern variety of Chinese. But what these data from Rook, Lakia, and Vietnamese show is that there were even more alternations that have been completely submerged. Now, so Vietnamese gives us information about presyllables. The presence of a presyllable doesn't tell us which presyllable. Yeah? And now we have also another important source of data presented by Baxter and Sagar, the Hmong-Mien data. So here are examples of Proto-Hmong-Mien from Martha Ratliff. In Hmong-Mien, Hmongic and Mienic languages have a lot of prenasalized initials, as you can see here. They are preserved, the nasalization is preserved in Hmongic, Miao Yu, and Mienic, so Yao Yu. They have become voiced consonants. So Pei becomes Bei, for instance. A single B corresponds to Mpe. Now, so in Mienic, whenever you see a voiced consonant, it means that it goes back to a prenasalized onset in Proto-Hmong-Mien. Unless it's a recent loanword from a Chinese variety that still have voicing. But there are very few of these examples. But now, if we look, that these are native Hmong-Mien words. But if we look at Chinese borrowings, what we see in Mien, for instance, that it's the same in Hmongic, we see a lot of examples like that. So that's from a paper of mine where I revised some of Baxter and Sagar's reconstruction. And there are actually hundreds of examples with voiced initials where in Middle Chinese you have P or aspirated P, and the same for the other place of articulation. And we see among these words, words that are not, probably that do not reflect Old Chinese, but look more like words that were not that common in Old Chinese texts. So what this indicates is that the donor Chinese language from which these words have been borrowed still had recent, even maybe in post-Han, still had some prenasalization that was lost completely in Middle Chinese. Yeah. So that's another source of data. So we've seen Lakia, Vietnamese, Min, Hmong-Mien. These are languages that contain hundreds of Chinese loanwords. Not all of them have been systematically studied. and they potentially include important data to reconstruct Old Chinese that is not otherwise accessible. And it's not a matter of reconstructing an very early state of Chinese. We've seen that we have the word for paper. So even Han Dynasty, in Han Dynasty, Chinese had features that are unthinkable if you only use the traditional philological sources. So that has implications for linguists, but also it's a bit overwhelming, I think, for non-linguists, of course. If you're not a linguist, nobody can expect that you will learn about Hmong-Mien, Kladai, Vietnamese. I don't expect any of you to do this work, but I want you to feel the importance of language diversity, the precious character of these endangered languages for our better understanding of Chinese and Old Chinese texts and Chinese history. We can't study Chinese as an isolated language, cut from its neighbors. And I think that we deserve some reverence to these interesting languages that preserve interesting data. Another thing now, and that will be the end of the third part of my talk, is Sino-Tibetan. Now, this is the Stammbaum, the tree that we've obtained from the PNAS article on phylogeny of Sino-Tibetan. So Laurent Saga was the first author. There were, of course, another article in Nature by the team, the Zhang Menghan's team. So in that paper, we have explored several possibilities about the place of Chinese in a tree. There is some evidence that Chinese is the first branch to split off the rest of the family, but it's not 100% conclusive yet. So that's also something I want to focus on. It's the best guess, let's say, that Chinese is the first branch, but it's not. The other possibilities can still be considered at the present moment. Maybe not in 20 years, but for now, yes. What this implies is that you see that this group contains a lot of branches. We're not, Sino-Tibetan is a huge family with an immense typological diversity. When we study ancient Indo-European languages or ancient Semitic languages, nobody can be the foremost specialist of ancient Greek or Latin without learning some Indo-European, if you're doing linguistics at least. Yeah. So you're expected to know some Sanskrit, Gothic, etc. Yeah. It helps you to interpret correctly some aspects of the grammar. Now, in the case of Chinese, very few people care about non-Chinese languages. If they know another language, it will be Japanese, which is not related to Chinese, but there's no tradition of learning Chinese and Tibetan, for instance, unless you're doing Buddhist studies, but it's another field. There is no tradition to study Kiranti and Garungic, etc. This is, of course, because of the accessibility of these languages. But these languages have recently become more accessible. We have dictionaries, we have grammars, and this is the job, my main job, and the job of many of my colleagues. The degree of knowledge we have on non-Semitic languages and unwritten languages of the family has exponentially exploded in the last 10 years. Now, this has implications for how we read Chinese. Let's have a look at the language I know best, Japfuk, which is spoken, so it's a Garungic language, it belongs to this branch here. Yeah, Japfuk. It's a branch that is closely related to Lolo-Burmese. So when you read these trees, you need to look at this. These are posterior probabilities. When you don't see any number, it means that there is 100% chance that this clade is real. When you see this, it means that it's poorly supported. Yeah. So here you see this clade combining all of the languages other than Chinese and Jingpo, for instance, is supported only by relatively poorly supported. Now, this Japok language spoken in Markham, Marakang, this district, this county, sorry. This is probably a hotspot of language diversity in China. Yeah, in this county you have 6 native languages, so including Japok and Situ, plus Chinese, plus Indo-Tibet. Yeah, so you have 8 languages. You see, so that's nobody talks about these apart from linguists, but I think it's already an interesting information. It's not very far from. It's only 400 kilometers from Chengdu. Yeah? Yeah. Now, these languages are the languages with the richest morphology in all of China. That's also something interesting. Let's have a look at this example. These are polysynthetic languages. Let's look at this verb form. Yeah. So, what does this mean? Let's have a look at these glosses. So actually, it has a lot of possible meanings. It can. One of the possible meaning, for instance, would be, may he prevent you to come and give you to come and give it to them or him, for instance. Yeah, but there are other interpretations for various reasons. I'm just showing this because this is what languages of the Sino-Tibetan family, other than Chinese, look like. And they are related to Chinese. So here the B is probably related to this word, B, which still exists in Cantonese, Bei, yeah, and is very common, of course, in Jiagu and very ancient Chinese. Now you see, we have languages that are genetically related with Chinese, which have a common ancestor and have a very rich and quite complex morphology. And not just affixes, but also stem alternations, inflections, etc. Person indexation, so conjugations. Yeah. Now, this obviously has implications for how we interpret the alternations we see in Middle Chinese. If you look at these things, for instance. So I briefly mentioned the alternations. So the 2 main type of alternations we see in Middle Chinese. One is the Qu-sheng alternation. So you have words with the shang-sheng, ru-sheng, or ping-sheng, or and they change to the Qu-sheng. So these are from Downer's article, very famous, and Audricourt, based on data from Vietnamese, proposed that the main origin of the Qu-sheng was a final S consonant. If we see it this way, if you remember what we saw just before, so for instance, this here, we had this I and at rhyming together and also written with the same phonetic element. Yeah? The idea is that the S eats up the T becomes Y, and the S changes to a Qu-sheng, to a tone. Yeah? So the evidence for this is a bit complicated. I'm not going to, because I would really need a few hours to talk about Vietnamese historical phonology and Vietic languages, and it's a bit technical. But what this implies is that when you see a Qu-sheng, alternation between a tone and a Qu-sheng, it's actually, that was pointed out very early, just a few years after Audricourt's article by Forrest, that it's actually a suffix. And there are suffixes, S suffixes, in non-Chinese languages that have, for example, nominalization. So chu and chu. Chu is a noun. Chu is a verb. Yeah. So this is an example of nominalization. There are many examples like that. Now, if we accept Audrico's idea that the tuition comes from S, we can compare it with Tibetan nominalization. Yeah. And Situ, so there are a few other languages that have a final S expressed in nominalization. Causative, so drink. Yin, im, to give, to drink. Here again, we have causative S suffix in many languages, including Limbu. Very clear example of that. I could also provide examples for the rest. I'm not going to spend too much time. I want to have more discussion, so I'll try to keep brief. But what I want to say is that the alternation we saw last week, when we see them from the eyes of Middle Chinese, they remain very opaque. But once we compare with other language families, with other perhaps more conservative languages of the Sino-Tibetan family, then we have a way to better interpret non-productive alternations. So it's easier actually to study morphology in a language where this morphology is productive. Yeah, that's how Indo-Europeanists do it, and Semiticists do it. So in Indo-European, Sanskrit and Greek have the richest morphology and the most productive one. The difference is that they happen to be also the two most prestigious languages of the family. So all scholars started with them. It was logical. The same is not true of Sino-Tibetan, where the languages with the most complex morphology are non-literary languages. So one major aspect of Old Chinese morphology is this tonal alternation. The other one is the voicing alternation. So here are a few examples. So last week we saw huai, which has two readings, gui and hui. This reading being transitive, and we saw the ghosts who broke the door, yeah, in a last week's presentation. So that and the shuvan indicated the ke initial. So that's an interesting reading. We don't find this anywhere in Chinese dialects. So the shuvan preserves more of them. Now, is that something we find elsewhere in some Tibetan? Yes. So these are examples from Japuk, yeah, and these are examples from Kali, a Kiranti language. Now, one question we could ask is, so we've got these pairs, but are they related across languages? Now, let's see by ourselves. If you compare Kaling and Japuk, at least this verb, to bend, g, is related to this kuk and guk by sound laws that are otherwise attested. And with Chinese, there are a few examples. So for instance, ji and xi. We know 系安全带. We have this gay. There is evidence that there's a final k here, actually. So it corresponds to this verb in Kali, kick. It's not really pronounced kick, actually. It's pronounced kune. But this is an abstract form that is easier to analyze the whole conjugation, because yeah, the conjugation of the Kaling verb is quite daunting. Yeah. So, but this is an abstract form which represents the basic protoform of the root of this verb. So, and we have the same alternation. Yeah. Now, the difference in Chinese is that you have no way to tell the direction. In the case of Chusheng, we had most people agree that it's from the other tones to the Chusheng. But in the case of this voicing, not all scholars agree. But if you look at, for instance, Japuk, the first verb, scatter. So that's an interesting one because it comes from Tibetan. So it's to scatter or to well, scatter seeds, yeah, to sow, for instance. This verb is borrowing from Tibetan ktor, but the intransitive form, ander, there's no corresponding intransitive form in Tibetan. So what it means is that here, this alternation applied to a borrowing. And since this one does not exist, we know that the direction is from this one to this one. Now, if by transitivity, if we accept the idea that this is related to culling and that culling is, and that all of these alternations, which we find in most languages of the family, are related to this alternation in Chinese, this also means that here, Japok evidence tells us the directionality of the alternation in Chinese, where it's not obvious from Chinese internal data. This means that if we want to understand the morphology of Old Chinese and use it to better understand Old Chinese texts, there should be some part in our curriculum of Old Chinese studies for the loanwords, for the study of the loanwords from Old Chinese into Hmong-Mien, Kradai, etc., and Vietic, and for the study of morphologically rich Sino-Tibetan languages. I think that better understanding the linguistic diversity of the Sino-Tibetan family and its neighbors is going to help to give a richer approach to the study of Old Chinese and contribute to debunk the older myths that have been present for too long about Old Chinese. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And I hope that you will ask me more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jacques, for today's lecture. Now we'll open the floor to our audience for questions. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, please use the hand raising function in Zoom, or send us your questions through chat so that we can ask them for you. We already have a question in chat now. Dr. Jacques, you said linguists of Chinese should learn the Vietic sound laws. Are there any recommended sources for where to learn these things? Yeah.
So the basic work has been done by Michel Ferlus. I've just written his name. And there is also a very interesting recent work by Mark Alves. Yeah. So if you search these names online, you will find a lot of papers. So some in French, but I think academic French should be fine for most people, and which contain a lot of useful data. The only problem, indeed, that's something for linguists to do, of course, is that there is no good comparative dictionary of Vietic yet. Yeah, that's a very needed source. You can also use the medieval dictionary, the first dictionary of Vietnamese by Alexandre de Rode, which is in Latin and Portuguese, which contains a lot of precious ancient words, including ancient Chinese loanwords. Yeah, and where you can find some evidence for.
Sorry, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so actually I have a lot of questions which possibly will take too much time, but it was only yesterday what I downloaded your paper, what you pointed in your presentation today about this genealogy of languages, and I didn't really read it thoroughly yet. But I noticed what I think one of this hypothesis, what you suggest is what Sino-Tibetic languages developed from one region in possibly in northern India. Do I get it right? So in this case, how plausible or unplausible it would be what Sino-Tibetan Tibetic languages could have some common words with Indo-European languages at the earliest stage.
Okay.
So I'm not a linguist. I have no idea about.
You mentioned Northern India. I don't think we mentioned Northern India as a possible place for Proto-Sino-Tibetan.
So possibly
no.
I misunderstood.
What we said in that article,
which was also
possibly it was not clear. So what we said in the article is that, which is very close actually to the conclusion of the team, the Fudan team, the Zhang, is that the Urheimat of Sino-Tibetan was probably the Yangshao culture, or the Zishan possibly. So in northern China, Yellow Valley, Yellow River Valley. So the question is now when they arrived in northern India. So that's an interesting problem because the linguistic diversity of Sino-Tibetan within China, nowadays China, is lower than what we find in the other side, so in India, Nepal, Bhutan, etc., where we have a lot of very strange branches. So it seems to imply that there were several migrations from China into these regions at a very early period. And the problem is that the archaeology of northern India and Nepal is not not studied well enough now. So it's difficult to. There's a lot of unknowns to ascertain this hypothesis. Now, the possibility of contact between all Chinese, between Sino-Tibetan and Indo-European, I don't think there is any possibility of direct contact before the arrival of the Tocharians, and it's not. I don't know how to date that, but there is possible evidence of a few loanwords from Old Chinese into Tocharian, from Tocharian into Old Chinese. These have been discussed by several scholars, but in any case, I don't think that these are significantly more ancient than the historical period.
We have another question from chat, and then we can let our another host today, Ms. Samira Mueller, to ask her questions. We'll read the questions from our audience first. Talking of learning, I believe the Vedic languages, do you suggest people learning the whole language or specific aspects of it, such as lexicon or grammar?
Yeah. Okay. So that's learning a language takes a huge amount of time, and if you're not linguists, it's not your job to learn languages that are not going to be directly useful to your work. I fully understand that. What I suggest for non-linguists is to get a glimpse of a sense of how these languages look like. Maybe with the help of various resources, to read excerpts from text and know a few words, at least know where they exist and where they are spoken, and how these features we see in them can help us directly to understand Chinese. I think that's the kind what I would suggest. So I'm not suggesting that everybody should learn Japuk, although if it's the case, I would be glad, and I can provide help if you're interested. But no, some Garongik can perhaps influence your thinking, enrich your thinking about Old Chinese texts and Old Chinese, maybe even philosophy.
Thank you. So how about we let our host, Ms. Samira Mueller, to ask her question.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, you talked a lot about loanwords from Old Chinese or even Han dynastic Chinese into Vedic languages and the Hmong-Mien, but what about like loan words like the Tocharian ones or even the ones which came later? How do you kind of see them in your data, in your linguistic data? Are there kind of inconsistencies in the Zheng series? Or I was wondering how you deal with that.
You mean loanwords from Tocharian?
Made from Tocharian, maybe from Iranian languages, or
There are not so many Tocharian loanwords that have been, I would say. So there's an article by Lubotsky and not all of these etymology are fully. Some of them look promising, but it's not. So Hannes Fellner also worked on that recently. Some examples are quite promising, but I would say there aren't so many of them. It's really a piecemeal of very few clear examples. Another thing we could also mention is the possibility of loanwords from Hmong-Mien and Vietic into Chinese. Yeah, so there have been proposals, and it's an open debate. It's possible that there are a lot of them. I don't know, but it's here. So we should also not assume always that the direction was from Chinese into those languages, but the opposite is also possible. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have another question in our chat. I have read some theories that the written evidence we have from Old Chinese does not necessarily correspond to a spoken language, and that the spoken language of ancient China may have been different from the written language. Any thoughts on that?
Okay. Yeah, I think that I know what you're talking about. But before I directly answer your comment, let me tell you something more general about the reconstruction. In my view, what Baxter and Saga have managed to demonstrate is that the traditional sources of Old Chinese are incomplete. They give us only a little glimpse of the phonological system of Old Chinese. And I think the logical continuation of what they've proposed, although they don't take this step, is that from the data we have, we cannot really reconstruct the whole system of Old Chinese. We can only reconstruct maybe 30%. It's a bit like if we had ancient Greek without the vowels or something like that. Yeah, that's the reason why Old Chinese is so damn difficult to understand, I think. Yeah, why is it that we can't really? We have so much trouble reading the texts. It shouldn't be that hard. I think the reason is because a lot of data is missing from the time when the languages were spoken. However, I think that your comment refers to something different. There is a fashionable theory about the Shang and the Zhou, and the idea that the Shang and the Zhou represent different people and belong to different families. I think that it's completely baseless. Yeah? It's often repeated idea that is not substantiated by any data. From what we've seen, for instance, I know very little about the Diaguan, but I've read, for instance, the Professor Takashima's work, and it's very clear that despite some changes in the syntax, there is a continuity in verbal, in grammatical markers and between the Diagu and the following language and late Zhou Chinese. Yeah, so I think yeah, it's quite pointless to look for that. Now, whether Chinese, some specific features of Chinese are through contact, it's also a possibility. Although I think the contact was perhaps something that, for instance, there's this scholar, Mike Werther, who has talked a lot about how languages become more simple morphologically. I think that one reason probably why Chinese lost its morphology in the Han Dynasty very late is because it was learned massively by non-native speakers. And this has completely changed the Chinese language. And this creolized version of Chinese has become our Chinese.
Oh, sorry, to follow up on that one, that is an interesting observation. You said that in Han Dynasty, there were a lot of non-native speakers learning our language, right? So are you referring to those from the Xiyu, from the...
Oh, no, no, but I'm referring to the invasion by the Qing Empire of the South.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because we had this, we had with Professor Golden in class about this interesting observation of what would the Xiongnu languages be like back in Han China? And it definitely is a very complex problem. It might be comprised of multiple languages spoken by multiple clans. And we were just interested in how come Sima Qian in his Shiji could transcribe the Xiongnu languages into Chinese.
Okay,
and, yeah.
So we could ask the same question. How did, for instance, Xenophon or Thucydides transcribe the speeches by Persians? Yeah, it's very clear that Greeks were not very good at learning languages. Yeah, you have, for instance, the Cyropedia, a very beautiful book, where but it's not history. It's Xenophon's imagination of how Cyrus and yes, I think he made up all the speeches, basically. Yeah. In the case of Thucydides, I don't think so, but probably he works through translators. It's not completely clear to me. In the case of Sima Qian, how he did it, also probably through translators. So there's a lot of things we don't know. Indeed. So for instance, the body comments about of the Chan Yu to Empress Lu, for instance, this certainly did exist, but how was it translated also? Imagine a poor translator who had to say, to translate that. Yeah, this is indeed a fascinating problem. So, but it's not true that we know nothing about these languages. We have a few sources, though they are a bit later than that. In the Shuoyuan, we have this interesting poem, the boatman's song, yeah, which is very nice. So it would be a remnant from a transcription from the Yue language. It's not yet understood. We have so much later in the Hohan Shu, we have this text from the Balang, the Balang song, which is much better understood. Actually, it's a very nice. It's the first language apart from Chinese attested in a Sino-Tibetan family, so it's extremely important, and we can understand some of it. Actually, it's and there is also a song, Xiongnu song, which is attested, which has been interpreted by Sasha Vovin as a Yeniseian language. So we have small extent of that. In terms of quantities, it's less than, for instance, the Punic we have in Poinulus. Yeah, but it's probably more than what we have in many Trümmersprachen of the antiquity in Europe, after all. Yeah, so yeah.
Thank you very much. I didn't even realize that there's this there are these songs that were left behind in the received text, and I think they're certainly very important. Any other questions from our audience? Oh, we have another question. Please go.
We can't hear you.
Yes. Okay, and our question, maybe this actually requires a longer discussion, but what would you suggest? How can I, as an outsider in phonology, make an opinion about the reliability of an etymological relation suggested by, for example, Schussler? In some cases, it looks like words proposed as etymological cognates have the same meaning and they look similar. But in some cases, their meaning is not too close to the proposed relative in Old Chinese or in Sino-Tibetic. So should I try to understand how it works, or I better leave it and not try to discuss it at all? Because
it depends
one
on
question
your own
keeps me
interest.
more than 1 month.
Yeah. That's the problem. It depends on your own interest. One another way is just to ask someone who is working in the field about his opinion. The thing I would advise you not to do is to copy reconstructions without understanding how they work. Yeah, especially mixed data. So say this guy said that and this guy said that. This will not be very helpful. Yeah. But I think, yeah, we can have open discussions on specific etymologies and it can be fun. Yeah.
I think time is about to be running out for today. So we'll probably just end here. I'd like to once again thank Dr. Jacques for our 2-session lecture. It was very informative and very interesting, certainly. And I would like to also thank you all for coming. The recording of today's lecture can be accessed within a few days on our website, sinologymethods.com. And should you have any further questions, please feel free to email your questions to admin@sinologymethods.com or contact us in Twitter @insinology. Please also note that this is our last lecture this year. The series will resume on January 20 next year with Professor Du Heng's lecture on the beginning of historical writing in early China. I'd like to thank Dr. Jacques again for his lecture. I would like to thank Madalena and Mariana for organizing the whole series and inviting me to chair. I also like to thank Ms. Samira Müller here today for hosting this session. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.